and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host, Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories from the public domain. Currently, we are reading through The Professor by Charlotte Brontë, and you can probably tell by the title of this video we are on, or going to be starting with chapter 14. So if you haven't watched the previous videos, you do need to go back and watch those or read the book up to chapter 14 by yourself. But either way, we are starting there, and I'm sure there will be more French in these chapters coming. So like I said before, I will do my best, but I am by no way fluent myself. But with that said, let's get into it. Chapter 14. If I was punctual in quitting Mademoiselle Reuter's domicile, I was at least equally punctual in arriving there. I came the next day at 5 minutes before 2, and on reaching the schoolroom door, before I opened it, I heard a rapid, gabbling sound, which warned me that the prière du midi was not yet concluded. I waited the termination thereof. It would have been impious to intrude my heretical presence during its progress. How the repeater of the prayer did cackle and splutter! I never before or since heard language announced with such steam-engine haste. Notre Père qui es au ciel went off like a shot. Then followed an address to Marie, Vierge Céleste, Reine des Anges, Maison d'Or, Tour d'ivoire, and then an invocation to the saint of the day, and then down they all sat, and the solemn rite was over, and I entered, flinging the door wide and striding in fast, as it was my wont to do now, for I had found that in entering with aplomb and mounting the estrade with emphasis consisted the grand secret of ensuring immediate silence. The folding doors between the two classes opened for the prayer were instantly closed. A maîtresse, workbox in hand, took her seat at her appropriate desk. The pupils sat still with their pens and books before them. My three beauties in the van, now well humbled by a demeanor of consistent coolness, sat erect with their hands folded quietly on their knees. They had given up giggling and whispering to each other, and no longer ventured to utter pert speeches in my presence. They now only talked to me occasionally with their eyes, by means of which organs they could still, however, say very audacious and coquettish things. Had affection, goodness, modesty, real talent ever employed those bright orbs as interpreters, I do not think I could have refrained from giving a kind and encouraging, perhaps an ardent reply now and then. But as it was, I found pleasure in answering the glance of vanity with the gaze of stoicism. Youthful, fair, brilliant as were many of my pupils, I can truly say that in me they never saw any other bearing than such as an austere, though just guardian, might have observed toward them. If any doubt the accuracy of this assertion, as inferring more conscientious self-denial or Scipio-like self-control than they feel disposed to give me credit for, let them take into consideration the following circumstances, which, while detracting from my merit, justify my veracity. Know, O incredulous reader, that a master stands in a somewhat different relation toward a pretty, light-headed, probably ignorant girl, to that occupied by a partner at a ball, or a gallant on the promenade. A professor does not meet his pupil to see her dressed in satin and muslin, with hair perfumed and curled, neck scarcely shaded by aerial lace, round white arms circled with bracelets, feet dressed for the gliding dance. It is not his business to whirl her through the waltz, to feed her with compliments, to heighten her beauty by the flush of gratified vanity. Neither does he encounter her on the smooth-rolled, tree-shaded boulevard, in the green and sunny park, whither she repairs clad in her becoming walking dress, her scarf thrown with grace over her shoulders, her little bonnet scarcely screening her curls, the red rose under its brim adding a new tint to the softer rose on her cheek, her face and eyes, too, illuminated with smiles, perhaps as transient as the sunshine of the gala day, but also quite as brilliant. It is not his office to walk by her side, to listen to her lively chat, to carry her parasol. scarcely larger than a broad green leaf, to lead in a ribbon her Blenheim spaniel or Italian greyhound. No, he finds her in the schoolroom, plainly dressed with books before her. Owing to her education or her nature, books are to her a nuisance, and she opens them with aversion. Yet her teacher must instill into her mind the contents of these books. That mind resists the admission of grave information. It recoils, it grows restive. Sullen tempers are shown. Disfiguring frowns spoil the symmetry of the face. Sometimes coarse gestures banish grace from the deportment, while muttered expressions, redolent of native and ineradicable vulgarity, desecrate the sweetness of the voice. Where the temperament is serene, though the intellect be sluggish, an unconquerable dullness opposes every effort to instruct. Where there is cunning but not energy, dissimulation, falsehoods, 1,000 schemes and tricks are put in play to evade the necessity of application. In short, to the tutor, female youth, female charms are like tapestry hangings, of which the wrong side is continually turned toward him. And even when he sees the smooth, neat, external surface, he so well knows what knots, long stitches, and jagged ends are behind that he has scarce a temptation to admire too fondly the seemly forms and bright colors exposed to general view. Our likings are regulated by our circumstances. The artist prefers a hilly country because it is picturesque. The engineer a flat one because it is convenient. The man of pleasures likes what he calls a fine woman. She suits him. The fashionable young gentleman admires the fashionable young lady. She is of his kind. The toil-worn, fagged, probably irritable tutor, blind almost to beauty, insensible to airs and graces, glories chiefly in certain mental qualities: application, love of knowledge, natural capacity, docility, truthfulness, gratefulness, are the charms that attract his notice and win his regard. These he seeks, but seldom meets. These, if by chance he finds, he would fain retain forever, and when separation deprives him of them, he feels as if some ruthless hand had snatched from him his only ewe lamb. Such being the case, and the case it is, my readers will agree with me that there was nothing either very meritorious or very marvelous in the integrity and moderation of my conduct at Mademoiselle Reuter's Pensionnat de Demoiselles. My first business this afternoon consisted in reading the list of places for the month, determined by the relative correctness of the compositions given the preceding day. The list was headed as usual by the name of Sylvie, that plain, quiet little girl I have described before as being at once the best and ugliest pupil in the establishment. The second place had fallen to the lot of a certain Leonie Ledru, a diminutive, sharp-featured, and parchment-skinned creature of quick wits, frail conscience, and indurated feelings. A lawyer-like thing, of whom I used to say that had she been a boy, she would have made a model of an unprincipled, clever attorney. Then came Eulalie, the proud beauty, the Juno of the school, whom 6 long years of drilling in the simple grammar of the English language had compelled, despite the stiff phlegm of her intellect, to acquire a mechanical acquaintance with most of its rules. No smile, no trace of pleasure or satisfaction appeared in Sylvie's nun-like and passive face, as she heard her name read first. I always felt saddened by the sight of that poor girl's absolute quiescence on all occasions, and it was my custom to look at her, to address her as seldom as possible. Her extreme docility, her assiduous perseverance would have recommended her warmly to my good opinion. Her modesty, her intelligence would have induced me to feel most kindly, most affectionately towards her, notwithstanding the almost ghastly plainness of her features, the disproportion of her form, the corpse-like lack of animation in her countenance, had I not been aware that every friendly word, every kind action, would be reported by her to her confessor, and by him misinterpreted and poisoned. Once I laid my hand on her head in token of approbation. I thought Sylvie was going to smile, her dim eye almost kindled, but presently she shrank from me. I was a man and a heretic, she, poor child, a destined nun and devoted Catholic. Thus, a fourfold wall of separation divided her mind from mine. A pert smirk and a hard glance of triumph was Leonie's method of testifying her gratification. Eulalie looked sullen and envious. She had hoped to be first. Hortense and Caroline exchanged a reckless grimace on hearing their names read out somewhere near the bottom of the list. The brand of mental inferiority was considered by them as no disgrace, their hopes for the future being based solely on their personal attractions. This affair arranged, the regular lesson followed. During a brief interval employed by the pupils in ruling their books, my eye, ranging carelessly over the benches, observed for the first time that the furthest seat in the furthest row, a seat usually vacant, was again filled by the new scholar, the Mademoiselle Henri, so ostentatiously recommended to me by the directress. Today I had on my spectacles. Her appearance, therefore, was clear to me at the first glance. I had not to puzzle over it. She looked young, yet had I been required to name her exact age, I should have been somewhat nonplussed. The slightness of her figure might have suited 17. A certain anxious and preoccupied expression of face seemed the indication of riper years. She was dressed, like all the rest, in a dark stuff gown and white collar. Her features were dissimilar to any there, not so rounded, more defined, yet scarcely regular. The shape of her head, too, was different, the superior part more developed, the base considerably less. I felt assured at first sight that she was not a Belgian. Her complexion, her countenance, her lineaments, her figure, were all distinct from theirs, and evidently the type of another race, of a race less gifted with fullness of flesh and plenitude of blood, less jocund, material, unthinking. When I first cast my eyes on her, she sat looking fixedly down, her chin resting on her hand, and she did not change her attitude till I commenced the lesson. None of the Belgian girls would have retained one position, and that a reflective one, for the same length of time. Yet, having intimated that her appearance was peculiar, as being unlike that of her Flemish companions, I have little more to say respecting it. I can pronounce no encomiums on her beauty, for she was not beautiful, nor offer condolences on her plainness, for neither was she plain. A careworn character of forehead and a corresponding moulding of the mouth struck me with a sentiment resembling surprise, but these traits would probably have passed unnoticed by any less crotchety observer. Now, reader, though I have spent more than a page in describing Mademoiselle Henri, I know well enough that I have left on your mind's eye no distinct picture of her. I have not painted her complexion, nor her eyes, nor her hair, nor even drawn the outline of her shape. You cannot tell whether her nose was aquiline or retroussé, whether her chin was long or short, her face square or oval, nor could I the first day. And it is not my intention to communicate to you at once a knowledge I myself gained by little and little. I gave a short exercise which they all wrote down. I saw the new pupil was puzzled at first with the novelty of the form and language. Once or twice she looked at me with a sort of painful solicitude, as not comprehending at all what I meant. Then she was not ready when the others were. She could not write her phrases so fast as they did. I would not help her. I went on relentless. She looked at me. Her eye said most plainly, "I cannot follow you." I disregarded the appeal, and carelessly leaning back in my chair, glancing from time to time with a nonchalant air out of the window, I dictated, a little faster. On looking toward her again, I perceived her face clouded with embarrassment, but she was still writing on most diligently. I paused a few seconds. She employed the interval in hurriedly repursuing what she had written, and shame and discomfiture were apparent in her countenance. She evidently found she had made a great nonsense of it. In 10 minutes more the dictation was complete, and having allowed a brief space in which to correct it, I took their books. It was with a reluctant hand Mademoiselle Henri gave up hers, but having once yielded it to my possession, she composed her anxious face, as if for the present she had resolved to dismiss regret, and had made up her mind to be thought unprecedentedly stupid. Glancing over her exercise, I found that several lines had been omitted, but what was written contained very few faults. I instantly inscribed "Bon" at the bottom of the page, and returned it to her. She smiled, at first incredulously, then as if reassured. but did not lift her eyes. She could look at me, it seemed, when perplexed and bewildered, but not when gratified. I thought that scarcely fair. Chapter 15. Some time elapsed before I again gave a lesson in the first class. The holiday of Whitsuntide occupied 3 days, and on the 4th it was the turn of the 2nd Division to receive my instructions. As I made the transit of the carré, I observed, as usual, the band of sewers surrounding Mademoiselle Henri. There were only about a dozen of them, but they made as much noise as might have sufficed for 50. They seemed very little under her control. 3 or 4 at once assailed her with importunate requirements. She looked harassed. She demanded silence, but in vain. She saw me, and I read in her eye pain that a stranger should witness the insubordination of her pupils. She seemed to entreat order. Her prayers were useless. Then I remarked that she compressed her lips and contracted her brow, and her countenance, if I read it correctly, said, "I have done my best." I seemed to merit blame notwithstanding. Blame me then who will. I passed on. As I closed the schoolroom door, I heard her say, suddenly and sharply, addressing one of the eldest and most turbulent of the lot, "Emilie Muhlenberg, ask me no question, and request of me no assistance, for a week to come. During that space of time, I will neither speak to you nor help you." The words were uttered with emphasis, nay, with vehemence, and a comparative silence followed. Whether the calm was permanent, I know not. 2 doors now closed between me and the carré. Next day was appropriated to the first class. On my arrival, I found the directress seated, as usual, in a chair between the 2 estrades, and before her was standing Mademoiselle Henri, in an attitude, as it seemed to me, of somewhat reluctant attention. The directress was knitting and talking at the same time. Amidst the hum of a large schoolroom, it was easy so to speak in the ear of one person as to be heard by that person alone, and it was thus Mademoiselle Reuter parleyed with her teacher. The face of the latter was a little flushed, not a little troubled. There was vexation in it, whence rustling I know not, for the directress looked very placid indeed. She could not be scolded in such gentle whispers and with so equable a mien. No, it was presently proved that her discourse had been of the most friendly tendency, for I heard the closing words. "C'est assez, ma bonne amie. À présent, je ne veux pas vous retenir davantage." Mademoiselle Henri turned away. Dissatisfaction was plainly evinced in her face, and a smile, slight and brief but bitter, distrustful, and I thought scornful, curled her lip as she took her place in the class. It was a secret, involuntary smile, which lasted but a second. An air of depression succeeded, chased away presently by one of attention and interest, when I gave the word for all the pupils to take their reading books. In general, I hated the reading lesson. It was such a torture to the ear to listen to their uncouth mouthings of my native tongue, and no effort of example or precept on my part ever seemed to effect the slightest improvement in their accent. Today, each in her appropriate key, lisped, stuttered, mumbled, and jabbered as usual. About 15 had racked me in turn, and my auricular nerve was expecting with resignation the discords of the 16th, when a full, though low voice read out in clear, correct English. "On his way to Perth, the king was met by a Highland woman, calling herself a prophetess. She stood at the side of the ferry by which he was about to travel to the north, and cried with a loud voice, 'My lord the king, if you pass this water, you will never return again alive.' From Vide, the History of Scotland." I looked up in amazement. The voice was a voice of Albion. The accent was pure and silvery. It only wanted firmness and assurance to be the counterpart of what any well-educated lady in Essex or Middlesex might have encountered. Yet the speaker or reader was no other than Mademoiselle Henri, in whose grave, joyless face I saw no mark of conscientiousness that she had performed an extraordinary feat. No one else evinced surprise either. Mademoiselle Reuter knitted away assiduously. I was aware, however, that at the conclusion of the paragraph she had lifted her eyelid and honored me with a glance sideways. She did not know the full excellency of the teacher's style of reading, but she perceived that her accent was not that of the others, and wanted to discover what I thought. I masked my visage with indifference and ordered the next girl to proceed. When the lesson was over, I took advantage of the confusion caused by breaking up to approach Mademoiselle Henri. She was standing near the window and retired as I advanced. She thought I wanted to look out, and did not imagine that I could have anything to say to her. I took her exercise book out of her hand, and as I turned over the leaves, I addressed her. "You have had lessons in English before?" I asked. "No, sir." "No? You read it well. You have been in England?" "Oh, no," with some animation. "You have been in English families?" Still, the answer was no. Here, my eye, resting on the flyleaf of the book, saw written, Francis Evan Henri. "Your name?" I asked. "Yes, sir." My interrogations were cut short. I heard a little rustling behind me, and close at my back was the directress, professing to be examining the interior of a desk. "Mademoiselle," said she, looking up and addressing the teacher, "will you have the goodness to go and stand in the corridor while the young ladies are putting on their things, and try to keep some order?" Mademoiselle Henri obeyed. "What splendid weather!" observed the directress cheerfully, glancing at the same time from the window. I assented and was withdrawing. "What of your new pupil, monsieur?" continued she, following my retreating steps. "Is she likely to make progress in English?" "Indeed, I can hardly judge. She possesses a pretty good accent. Of her real knowledge of the language I have as yet had no opportunity of forming an opinion." "And her natural capacity, monsieur? I have had my fears about that. Can you relieve me by an assurance at least of its average power?" "I see no reason to doubt its average power, mademoiselle, but really I scarcely know her, and have not had time to study the caliber of her capacity. I wish you a very good afternoon." She still pursued me. "You will observe, monsieur, and tell me what you think? I could so much better rely on your opinion than on my own. Women cannot judge of these things as men can. And excuse my pertinacity, monsieur, but it is natural I should feel interested about this poor little girl. Pauvre petite. She has scarcely any relations. Her own efforts are all she has to look to. Her acquirements must be her sole fortune. Her present position has once been mine, or nearly so. It is then but natural I should sympathize with her, and sometimes when I see the difficulties she has in managing pupils, I reel quite chagrined. I doubt not that she does her best. Her intentions are excellent, but monsieur, she wants tact and firmness. I have talked to her on the subject, but I am not fluent, and probably did not express myself with clearness. She never appears to comprehend me. Now, would you occasionally, when you see an opportunity, slip in a word of advice to her on the subject? Men have so much more influence than women have. They argue so much more logically than we do, and you, monsieur, in particular, have so paramount a power of making yourself obeyed. A word of advice from you could not but do her good, even if she were sullen and headstrong, which I hope she is not. She would scarcely refuse to listen to you. For my own part, I can truly say that I never attend one of your lessons without deriving benefit from witnessing your management of the pupils. The other masters are a constant source of anxiety to me. They cannot impress the young ladies with sentiments of respect, nor restrain the levity natural to youth. In you, monsieur, I feel the most absolute confidence. Try, then, to put this poor child into the way of controlling our giddy, high-spirited Brabantoises. But, monsieur, I would add one more word. Don't alarm her amour-propre. Beware of inflicting a wound there. I reluctantly admit that in that particular she is blamably, some would say ridiculously, susceptible. I fear I have touched this sore point inadvertently, and she cannot get over it." During the greater part of this harangue, my hand was on the lock of the outer door. I now turned it. "Au revoir, mademoiselle," said I, and I escaped. I saw the directress's stock of words was yet far from exhausted. She looked after me. She would fain have detained me longer. Her manner toward me had been altered ever since I had begun to treat her with hardness and indifference. She almost cringed to me on every occasion. She consulted my countenance incessantly, and beset me with innumerable little officious attentions. Servility creates despotism. This slavish homage, instead of softening my heart, only pampered whatever was stern and exacting in its mood. The very circumstance of her hovering around me like a fascinated bird seemed to transform me into a rigid pillar of stone. Her flatteries irritated my scorn. Her blandishments confirmed my reserve. At times I wondered what she meant by giving herself such trouble to win me when the more profitable Palais was already in her nets, and when, too, she was aware that I possessed her secret, for I had not scrupled to tell her as much. But the fact is that it was her nature to doubt the reality and undervalue the worth of modesty, affection, disinterestedness, to regard these qualities as foibles of character. So it was equally her tendency to consider pride, hardness, selfishness as proofs of strength. She would trample on the neck of humility. She would kneel at the feet of disdain. She would meet tenderness with secret contempt. Indifference she would woo with ceaseless assiduities. Benevolence, devotedness, enthusiasm were her antipathies. For dissimulation and self-interest she had a preference. They were real wisdom in her eyes. Moral and physical degradation, mental and bodily inferiority, she regarded with indulgence. They were foils, capable of being turned to good account as set-offs for her own endowments. To violence, injustice, tyranny she succumbed. They were her natural masters. She had no propensity to hate, no impulse to resist them. The indignation their behests awake in some hearts was unknown in hers. From all this it resulted that the false and selfish called her wise, the vulgar and debased termed her charitable, the insolent and unjust dubbed her amiable, the conscientious and benevolent generally at first accepted as valid her claim to be considered one of themselves. But ere long the plating of pretension wore off, the real material appeared below, and they laid her aside as a deception. Chapter 16. In the course of another fortnight, I had seen sufficient of Frances Evans Henri to enable me to form a more definite opinion of her character. I found her possessed in a somewhat remarkable degree of at least two good points, viz., perseverance and a sense of duty. I found she was really capable of applying to study, of contending with difficulties. At first I offered her the same help which I had always found it necessary to confer on the others. I began with unloosing for her each knotty point, but I soon discovered that such help was regarded by my new pupil as degrading. She recoiled from it with a certain proud impatience. Hereupon I appointed her long lessons, and left her to solve alone any perplexities they might present. She set to the task with serious ardor, and having quickly accomplished one labor, eagerly demanded more. So much for her perseverance. As to her sense of duty, it evinced itself thus. She liked to learn, but hated to teach. Her progress as a pupil depended upon herself, and I saw that on herself she could calculate with certainty. Her success as a teacher rested partly, perhaps chiefly, upon the will of others. It cost her a more painful effort to enter into conflict with this foreign will, to endeavor to bend it into subjection, for in what regarded people in general the action of her will was impeded by many scruples. It was as unembarrassed as strong where her own affairs were concerned, and to it she could at any time subject her inclination, if that inclination went counter to her convictions of right. Yet, when called upon to wrestle with the propensities, the habits, the faults of others, of children especially, who are deaf to reason, and, for the most part, insensate to persuasion, her will sometimes almost refused to act. Then came in the sense of duty, and forced the reluctant will into operation. A wasteful expense of energy and labor was frequently the consequence. Frances toiled for and with her pupils like a drudge, but it was long ere her conscientious exertions were rewarded by anything like docility on their part, because they saw that they had power over her, inasmuch as by resisting her painful attempts to convince, persuade, control, by forcing her to the employment of coercive measures, they could inflict upon her exquisite suffering. Human beings, human children especially, seldom deny themselves the pleasure of exercising a power which they are conscious of possessing, even though that power consists only in a capacity to make others wretched. A pupil whose sensations are duller than those of his instructor, while his nerves are tougher and his bodily strength perhaps greater, has an immense advantage over that instructor, and he will generally use it relentlessly, because the very young, very healthy, very thoughtless, know neither how to sympathize nor how to spare. Frances, I fear, suffered much. A continual weight seemed to oppress her spirits. I have said she did not live in the house, and whether in her own abode, wherever that might be, she wore the same preoccupied, unsmiling, sorrowfully resolved air that always shaded her features under the roof of Mademoiselle Reuter, I could not tell. One day I gave as a devoir the trite little anecdote of Alfred tending cakes in the herdsman's hut, to be related with amplifications. A singular affair most of the pupils made of it. Brevity was what they had chiefly studied. The majority of the narratives were perfectly unintelligible. Those of Sylvie and Léonie Ledru alone pretended to anything like sense and connection. Eulalie, indeed, had hit upon a clever expedient for at once ensuring accuracy and saving trouble. She had obtained access, somehow, to an abridged history of England, and had copied the anecdote out fair. I wrote on the margin of her production, "stupid and deceitful," and then tore it down the middle. Last in the pile of single-leaved devoirs, I found one of several sheets neatly written out and stitched together. I knew the hand and scarcely needed the evidence of the signature, Francis Evans Henri, to confirm my conjecture as to the writer's identity. Night was my usual time for correcting devoirs, and my own room the usual scene of such task most onerous hitherto, and it seemed strange to me to feel rising within me an incipient sense of interest, as I snuffed the candle and addressed myself to the perusal of the poor teacher's manuscript. Now, thought I shall see a glimpse of what she really is. I shall get an idea of the nature and extent of her powers. Not that she can be expected to express herself well in a foreign tongue, but still, if she has any mind, here will be a reflection of it. The narrative commenced by a description of a Saxon peasant's hut, situated within the confines of a great leafless winter forest. It represented an evening in December. Flakes of snow were falling, and the herdsman foretold a heavy storm. He summoned his wife to aid him in collecting their flock, roaming far away on the pastoral banks of the Thone. He warns her that it will be late ere they return. The good woman is reluctant to quit her occupation of baking cakes for the evening meal. But acknowledging the primary importance of securing the herd and flocks, she put on her sheepskin mantle, and addressing a stranger who rests half reclined on a bed of rushes near the hearth, bids him mind the bread till her return. "Take care, young man," she continues, "that you fasten the door well after us, and above all open to none in our absence. Whatever sound you hear, stir not and look not out. The night will soon fall. This forest is most wild and lonely. Strange noises are often heard therein after sunset. Wolves haunt these glades, and Danish warriors infest the country. Worse things are talked of. You might chance to hear, as it were, a child cry, and on opening the door to afford it succor, a great black bull or a shadowy goblin dog might rush over the threshold, or, more awful still, if something flapped, as with wings, against the lattice, and then a raven or a white dove flew in and settled on the hearth, such a visitor would be a sure sign of misfortune to the house. Therefore, heed my advice, and lift the latchet for nothing." Her husband calls her away. Both depart. The stranger, left alone, listens awhile to the muffled snow wind, the remote swollen sound of the river, and then he speaks. "It is Christmas Eve," says he. "I mark the date. Here I sit alone on a rude couch of rushes, sheltered by the thatch of a herdsman's hut. I, whose inheritance was a kingdom, owe my night's harborage to a poor serf. My throne is usurped. My crown presses the brow of an invader. I have no friends. My troops wander broken in the hills of Wales. Reckless robbers spoil my country. My subjects lie prostrate, their breasts crushed by the heel of the brutal Dane. Fate, thou hast done thy worst, and now thou standest before me, resting thy hand on thy blunted blade. Aye, I see thine eye confront mine, and demand why I still live, why I still hope. Pagan demon, I credit not thine omnipotence, and so cannot succumb to thy power. My God, whose Son, as on this night, took on him the form of man, and for man vouchsafed to suffer and bleed, controls thy hand, and without his behest thou canst not strike a stroke. My God is sinless, eternal, all-wise. In him is my trust, and though stripped and crushed by thee, though naked, desolate, void of resource, I do not despair. I cannot despair. Were the lance of Guthrum now wet with my blood, I should not despair. I watch, I toil, I hope. I pray Jehovah in his own time will aid. I need not continue the quotation. The whole devoir was in the same strain. There were errors of orthography. There were foreign idioms. There were some faults of construction. There were verbs irregular transformed into verbs regular. It was mostly made up, as the above example shows, of short and somewhat rude sentences, and the style stood in great need of polish and sustained dignity. Yet such as it was, I had hitherto seen nothing like it in the course of my professional experience. The girl's mind had conceived a picture of a hut, of the two peasants, of the crownless king. She had imagined the wintry forest. She had recalled the old Saxon ghost legends. She had appreciated Alfred's courage under calamity. She had remembered his Christian education, and had shown him, with the rooted confidence of those primitive days, relying on the scriptural Jehovah for aid against the mythological destiny. This she had done without a hint from me. I had given the subject, but not said a word about the manner of treating it. I will find, or make, an opportunity of speaking to her, I said to myself, as I rolled the devoir up. I will learn what she has of English in her beside the name of Frances Evans. She is no novice in the language, that is evident, yet she told me she had neither been in England, nor taken lessons in English, nor lived in English families. In the course of my next lesson, I made a report of the other devoirs, dealing out praise and blame in very small retail parcels, according to my custom, for there was no use in blaming severely, and high encomiums were rarely merited. I said nothing of Mademoiselle Henri's exercise, and spectacles on nose, I endeavored to decipher in her countenance her sentiments at the omission. I wanted to find out whether in her existed a consciousness of her own talents. If she thinks she did a clever thing in composing that devoir, she will now look mortified, thought I. Grave as usual, almost somber, was her face. As usual, her eyes were fastened on the cahier opened before her. There was something, I thought, of expectation in her attitude, and I concluded a brief review of the last devoir, and when casting it from me and rubbing my hands, I bade them take their grammars. Some slight change did pass over her air and mien, as though she now relinquished a faint prospect of pleasant excitement. She had been waiting for something to be discussed in which she had a degree of interest. The discussion was not to come on, so expectations sank back, shrunk and sad. But attention, promptly filling up the void, repaired in a moment the transient collapse of feature. Still, I felt rather than saw, during the whole course of the lesson, that a hope had been wrenched from her, and that if she did not show distress, it was because she would not. At 4 o'clock, when the bell rang and the room was in immediate tumult, instead of taking my hat and starting from the estrade, I sat still a moment. I looked at Frances. She was putting her books into her cabas. Having fastened the button, she raised her head, encountering my eye. She made a quiet, respectful obeisance, as bidding good afternoon, and was turning to depart. "Come here," said I, lifting my finger at the same time. She hesitated. She could not hear the words amidst the uproar now pervading both schoolrooms. I repeated the sign. She approached. Again she paused within half a yard of the estrade, and looked shy and still doubtful whether she had mistaken my meaning. "Step up," I said, speaking with decision. It is the only way of dealing with diffident, easily embarrassed characters, and with some slight manual aid, I presently got her placed just where I wanted her to be. That is, between my desk and the window, where she was screened from the rush of the 2nd Division, and where no one could sneak behind her to listen. "Take a seat," I said, placing a tabouret, and I made her sit down. I knew what I was doing would be considered a very strange thing, and what was more, I did not care. Frances knew it also, and I fear, by an appearance of agitation and trembling, that she cared much. I drew from my pocket the rolled-up devoir. "This is yours, I suppose," said I, addressing her in English, for I now felt sure she could speak English. "Yes," she answered distinctly, and as I unrolled it and laid it out flat on the desk before her with my hand upon it and a pencil in that hand, I saw her moved, and as it were, kindled, her depression beamed as a cloud might behind which the sun is burning. "This devoir has numerous faults," said I. "It will take you some years of careful study before you are in a condition to write English with absolute correctness. Attend, I will point out some principal defects." And as I went through it carefully, noting every error and demonstrating why they were errors and how the words or phrases ought to have been written, in the course of this sobering process she became calm. I now went on. "As to the substance of your devoir, Mademoiselle Henri, it has surprised me. I perused it with pleasure, because I saw in it some proofs of taste and fancy. Taste and fancy are not the highest gifts of the human mind, but such as they are, you possess them, not probably in a paramount degree, but in a degree beyond what the majority can boast. You may then take courage, cultivate the faculties that God and nature have bestowed on you, and do not fear in any crisis of suffering, under any pressure of injustice, to derive free and full consolation from the consciousness of their strength and rarity." "Strength and rarity," I repeated to myself. Aye, the words are probably true. For on looking up I saw the sun had dissevered its screening cloud, her countenance was transfigured, a smile shone in her eyes, a smile almost triumphant. It seemed to say, "I am glad you have been forced to discover so much of my nature. You need not so carefully moderate your language. Do you think I am myself a stranger to myself? What you tell me in terms so qualified I have known fully from a child." She did say this as plainly as a frank and flashing glance could, but in a moment the glow of her complexion, the radiance of her aspect had subsided. If strongly conscious of her talents, she was equally conscious of her harassing defects, and the remembrance of those, obliterated for a single second, now reviving with sudden force, at once subdued the two vivid characters in which her sense of her powers had been expressed. So quick was the revulsion of feeling, I had not time to check her triumph by reproof. Ere I could contract my brows to a frown, she had become serious and almost mournful looking. "Thank you, sir," said she, rising. There was gratitude both in her voice and in the look with which she accompanied it. It was time indeed for our conference to terminate, for when I glanced around, behold, all the boarders, the day scholars had departed, were congregated within a yard or two of my desk, and stood staring with eyes and mouths wide open. The three matriesses formed a whispering knot in one corner, and close at my elbow was the directress, sitting on a low chair, calmly clipping the tassels of her finished purse. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. Pretty good? If you liked the episode, please like and subscribe. Share me with all your friends. Get me out there. And I'll be seeing you guys next Wednesday for more from the professor. Bye!